Narrative in gaming. Talk about a tricky topic to discuss nowadays. With the growing trend of games trying to be more artistic, we're seeing a lot more games drifting towards more thought-provoking stories or hot-button issues. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing, this does exacerbate the issue of the growing rift between gameplay and story. Modern gaming lately seems to segregate story and gameplay, using gameplay as a buffer zone in between plot elements, then stuffing fat stacks of context down our throat. This disconnect is jarring because it not only stifles the imagination of the player, but it also breaks the pacing of a game rather than making it a fluid experience. Video games have the unique ability to integrate the player with this developed world and have them influence it at their whims, yet the aforementioned rift before just seems to bring about this trend of movie games. I feel like this rift is the worst possible direction gaming could go in. If a game primarily wants to tell a story, it should do so by having narrative and gameplay work off each other rather than be two separate entities. With this video, I plan to explore several games that do neat things with the narrative process in an attempt to remind the player and developers the potential for unique storytelling hidden in the gaming model. My first and strongest example, oddly enough, is a game from the past about the future.
Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
System Shock 2 was a game that was highly praised for its narrative process, and with good reason. Developed just before the turn of the century, this game didn't have the luxury of existing game models to work with, or cutscenes to get their message across. Looking Glass Studio, however, took this as an opportunity to set their own standard of how storytelling should be handled in games. Many elements of the game have the narrative playing off gameplay elements, and vice versa, in order to make the experience as seamless as possible. The game is meant to be a horror experience, and this is reflected in-game by your lack of supplies, constant encounter with disfigured creatures, and the main NPCs of the game being somewhat oppressive.
Pick up the battery from the floor and find a recharger. The one you used before is in hard vacuum now, I'm afraid, but there should be another one on this deck.
Certain game elements are also explained multiple times through either the plot or just the general environment. Respawn chambers effectively eliminate the fear of death for you, but various unlucky NPCs are strewn about the area just barely near the respawn point but meeting their untimely demise before they could secure their lifeline. All the side characters that opted for suicide often have corresponding items in their inventory, such as booze, a verbal diary of their final thoughts, or an actual gun to their head. Game mechanics such as hacking or modifying aren't explained in a tutorial, but rather touched upon by some angry NPC's journal over how these haphazard hacks break protocol.
God damn, somebody's hacked into this thing again. I'm gonna tell Delacroix.
While the story may be set in stone, it never feels like a game or a movie, but rather an experience that you find yourself going through. The spiritual sequel, BioShock, tried to recapture this charm, but many of the narrative tricks in System Shock 2 were sacrificed to the cutscene gods, which is unfortunate. Many people praise System Shock 2 as a hallmark in gaming, and I find myself agreeing with them after what I saw them do with the story. It is utterly fantastic. Another game that handles narrative in gaming well is a recent example. Papers, Please is another neat game that has gameplay and story working together in interesting ways. The game is essentially a choose-your-own adventure, where your decisions directly influence the outcome of several story elements in the main mode. The great thing is that the choices aren't watered down at all. Lucas Pope has accounted for nearly every possible choice the player base will make, and has written up scenarios that affect plot progression, the player's actual scoring system, and also the moral compass of the player. These scenarios are often engrossing because players will often find themselves deciding if they could risk letting someone through at the cost of their in-game score, or will they sacrifice their humanity just to be the most efficient processor ever? Thanks to Pope's efforts, the sheer amount of choice in this game helps it feel like the player's story rather than the developer's. The various smaller plot elements also help to complement the game since they often add more charm to the story and toy with the player's cost-to-benefit analysis through moral or achievement benefits. By taking the player's meta logic into account, Pope weaved a fantastic narrative experience by challenging the player rather than entertaining them. When the player finds himself balancing the cost for their in-game son's birthday versus the risk of a game over prompt and knowing they're a monster, you know this game is a unique experience. A third game that handles narrative in an interesting way is an underrated gem and my personal favorite.
Look, old man, you can talk big all you want, but at the end of the day, you're a corporate drone collecting a paycheck. You answer to a cardboard cutout half your age with the fashion sense of a screaming child. He spends thousands on his fucking hair. I may be on the run, but I'm a lot better off than you, some monkey in a suit who can't even talk and click his pen at the same time.
Alpha Protocol is a strange being, touting the title of espionage RPG and a moral choice system in a market rife with similar claims. In Alpha Protocol, parts of the gameplay go hand in hand with story, directly influencing several factors both immediately and further down the game's story. The dialogue tree is probably the best example of how to handle this sort of mechanic in games. Each choice that the player makes has an immediate reaction based on circumstances, but can also have noticeable consequences in other missions later on, or have passive effects on NPC influence or enemy AI. The game also puts you on the spot by adding timers to your decisions, which adds an air of realism to the dialogue by not giving the player a gross amount of time to balance their decisions. Choices start to snowball, and players will rarely see a scenario where they feel like a decision was ultimately worthless. Handling intel in this game is done through brokering it with a journalist you know for her assistance in other missions, selling it on the black market for a lump sum, or keeping it to yourself to stay on the down low. NPC interactions dramatically impact how a mission can play out, either immediately or later on through the game. Marburg is a pretty notorious antagonist since his schemes are affected directly by how you handle certain missions in Rome.
And you were the one who crossed paths with a German mercenary in Moscow. Z.
I get around.
Steve Heck is a fun NPC that can help or hinder your mission depending on how you approach his eccentricities.
This is dry cleaning solution. Active ingredient is perchloroethylene. Get stains out like a champ. Like a champ win, believe you me.
Gonna be hard getting that stuff down his throat. Want me to get a funnel?
A funnel? Yeah! That's a killer idea!
While the plot may be very run-of-the-mill, seeing the player's actions influence the game on multiple levels helps to create a more engaging experience since the game's acknowledging these inputs in various ways. It helps to motivate the player to play further since it feels more like their experience and provokes a need to see where this rabbit hole of various decisions goes. While not the most highly rated game, their handling of the dialogue tree system in this day and age was well executed, and complemented the genre of espionage RPG quite effectively. Now, while the next few games aren't the best examples of creative narrative in gaming, they're what I like to call half-rights. Many of these games are run-of-the-mill experiences in terms of game models or narrative effects, but they have one or two tricks that I personally would like to see more of in gaming. A quick and dirty half-right I would like to touch on is an old SNES game called Cybernator. This game wasn't the most well-known title out there. It was a side-scrolling action game with a very run-of-the-mill plot and decent gameplay. Nothing outstanding. One thing I loved about Cybernator though was the fact that a failure of a mission at times did not trigger a fail state. Certain missions in the game have conditions where you could fail miserably but not trigger a game over. These scenarios are often touched upon in-game but rarely outright affect the levels. But it's a nice thing to see. Rarely do we see an instance where the player can legitimately screw up and still progress, but still note that they messed up hard. Cybernator sadly underutilizes, but I'd love to see more of this game style in the future. Another example of a half-right for gaming narrative is Nier. Nier was a fairly run-of-the-mill RPG experience. A fantastic story paired with gameplay serviceable enough to get the player in between set plot pieces, along with some enticing side quests to reward the player. However, Nier did two very neat things with gameplay to complement the plot. One thing Nier did well was literally change the game to service the plot. Certain plot elements had noticeable and overt gameplay changes in order to help complement the story at hand. These segments stand out because they mess with the player's head and force them to reacclimate to this new game element that is often centered around the plot at hand. It helps to get the player focused on these plot elements and are just generally entertaining overall. Another good thing Nier did with narrative is that it didn't frequently interrupt you. Sure, there were some cutscenes during tense moments, but the game doesn't stop at all for any in-game banter relevant to the task at hand. This is a nice thing gameplay-wise since it doesn't deter you from side quests through fat stacks of context. You can get the quest and get it done while having a fun side story drip-fed to you. It's not a revolutionary or necessary mechanic to have in gaming, but I feel that this minor thing made Nier's story and probably gaming as a whole more fluid and enjoyable. One last game that does narrative half-right is the Half-Life series. Valve and Half-Life have won multiple awards for their ability to tell an engaging story through video games, and with good reason. The Half-Life series has never been the most thought-provocative story. Every game is just about a scientist in power armor shooting aliens and exploding things. The thing that makes the Half-Life series great is how it uses the game engine to convey Gordon's element of danger to the player. You never actually hear Gordon say anything about the circumstances, but every legitimate threat carries the consequence of a game over. This is interesting because under circumstances ranging from evading the military police, to navigating support structures of a bridge, to platforming through Zen, you feel the element of threat in these games because the risk of consequence is tied to them. By integrating the element of loss with a silent protagonist, Gordon effectively becomes a vessel for the player to experience the Half-Life world. Players are engrossed into the set pieces because the player shares the same risks Gordon does, making the game much more immersive. Half-Life 2 does other neat tricks to disguise loading screens through dialogue cutscenes, but it's a weird trade-off at times and breaks the pacing of the story as well. Half-Life as a whole presents its somewhat average story in such a fantastic way, and their technique for in-game storytelling through gameplay is still praised heartily to this day. The act of gaming has done great things in order to convey a story in a unique fashion, which is a great thing to see. However, the void between these great experiments and AAA movie games is steadily growing, and some modern story games don't even feel like games at all. For plot-driven games to truly flourish, developers cannot ignore the other aspects of a game. By having a game's story work alongside its gameplay, a good story gets turned into an engrossing one. Don't stifle imagination with cutscene exposition. Let the player into the game, and they'll appreciate the story you build for them.
Hey, my friend. Gone to go?